This is the end of the line for you, girl. Imagine your own stepfather binding your wrists, stripping your boots, and leaving you to die in the brutal 110-degree Texas desert. Today, we follow 20-year-old Abigail Vance, abandoned with nothing but a dented canteen, only to be rescued by a scarred cowboy who rules his land by one law. No human being is a commodity. Will she survive when her past comes back with loaded guns? Smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to ride with us into the lawless West.
The wagon lurched. It didn't just stop, it slammed to a halt, the heavy iron-rimmed wheels grinding deep into the jagged red rock. Abigail Vance flew forward. Her bound wrists scraped hard against the splintered pine floorboards, and a thick, suffocating cloud of alkali dust billowed up, filling her nose and throat with the bitter, dry taste of the Texas border. She coughed, her chest heaving, trying to suck in air that felt like liquid fire. "Get up," a voice spat. The canvas covering was ripped back with a violent jerk, and the midday sun struck her eyes like a physical blow. Abby winced, squinting through the blinding glare at the man standing over her. Harlan Vance, her stepfather, a man who measured the entire world in dollars, cents, and gambling debts. "This is the end of the line for you, girl," Harlan said, his voice flat, devoid of a single shred of human kindness. Abby didn't beg. Her throat was too parched to stretch for words anyway, but she wouldn't have given him the satisfaction. For 3 long weeks, since her father had passed away back in Boston, Harlan had treated her like a piece of baggage, a nuisance to be traded or discarded. He had tried to sell her off under a fraudulent mail-order bride contract at the last outpost, and when she fought back, when she refused to let her life be signed away on a cheap piece of paper, he had decided to simply drop the weight. Harlan reached down, his heavy knife flashing in the sun as he sliced through the coarse hemp ropes binding her wrists. He didn't do it out of mercy. He just didn't want to waste a good rope. "Out!" he barked. Abby stumbled over the tailgate, her bare feet hitting the scorching red dirt. Her pale yellow cotton dress, once clean and respectable, was now ruin-stained with sweat, grease, and the dust of 3 states. Before she could even find her balance, Harlan tossed a dented canteen and a small, empty canvas sack at her feet. The whip cracked. The horses strained. Abby stood frozen as the wagon rattled away, disappearing rapidly into a towering wall of red dust heading west toward California. Then came the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that pressed against her ears. She looked around. There was nothing. No town, no buildings. Just a desolate crossroads where 2 wagon trails cut through the dirt, surrounded by endless miles of prickly pear, stunted mesquite, and a sky so vast and blue it made her feel microscopic. In the far distance, heat waves made the purple mountain ridges dance and bleed into the horizon. She was 20 years old, completely alone, and stranded in a desert that didn't care if she lived or died. Abby looked down at her feet. The skin was already blistering from the baking earth. Her deucer had taken her boots 2 days ago, a petty punishment for her defiance. A weaker soul would have sat down and let the sun finish the job. But Abby closed her eyes, took a ragged breath, and knelt in the dirt. Her fingers trembled, but her mind was clear. She took the hem of her ruined petticoat and tore a long, thick strip of muslin. Carefully, methodically, she began to bind her own feet, wrapping the cloth tight against the raw skin, tucking the edges in secure. It was a slow, painful business, but she did it. A human being wasn't meant to be discarded like trash on the side of a road, and she refused to let Harlan's cruelty dictate her end. If she only had an hour of life left, she would spend it standing up. She picked up the dented canteen. It sloshed, maybe a quarter full, enough for an afternoon if she was careful. Suddenly, a sound cut through the hot wind, the steady, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a horse walking at an easy pace. Abby stiffened, her hand instantly darting into the dirt, her fingers wrapping around a heavy, jagged piece of flint rock she had spotted near her knee. She scrambled to her feet, backing up against a large boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Out here, a lone woman was a target. The rider emerged from the shimmering heat haze to the south. He rode a massive, powerful buckskin stallion, sitting the saddle with a casual, practiced ease that belonged to someone who lived in the leather. As he drew closer, Abby took him in. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded blue cavalry shirt and a wide-brimmed Stetson that cast a deep shadow over his features. But it was his face that made her breath catch. A jagged, pale scar cut across his sun-bronzed jawline, running up toward a pair of piercing, intelligent gray eyes. Those eyes swept over her, assessing the scene in a single, unbroken glance: the torn dress, the bound feet, the lack of a horse, and the sharp rock gripped tightly in her white-knuckled fist. He didn't crowd her. 10 paces back, he pulled on the reins, bringing the stallion to a smooth halt. He didn't reach for his sidearm. He didn't even dismount. He just sat there, respecting the boundary she had drawn with her defensive posture. "You're a long way from a cool porch, ma'am," the man said. His voice was a deep, gravelly Texas drawl that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. "I know exactly where I am," Abby lied, her voice raspy and thin, though she kept her eyes locked on his. The man tilted his head, a faint, humorless twitch appearing at the corner of his scarred mouth. He slowly reached up, took off his Stetson, and rested it on the horn of his saddle. It was an old, courtly gesture of respect, completely jarring out here in the wastes. "Name's Silas Woodward," he said quietly. "I run a spread about 10 miles east of this dirt. I don't mean you any harm." "Miss Vance," she said, her grip tightening on the flint. "Abigail Vance." Silas looked down at her bound feet, then back up at her face. The gray eyes softened, just a fraction. With a look that wasn't pity, it was recognition. He knew what a broken world looked like. "Well, Miss Vance," Silas said, leaning slightly forward on his saddle, "the nearest town is a 15-mile walk through alkali tanks and rattlers, and the sun is fixing to get meaner. You can keep holding that rock if it makes you feel safe, but I've got an empty saddle horn, a full skin of sweet water, and a job that needs doing at my place. No strings, just honest wages for honest work." Abby stared at him, searching his face for the hidden trap. She had learned the hard way that men always wanted something in return for their charity. "And what's the price for the ride, Mr. Woodward?" she asked, her voice laced with bitter ice. Silas's expression hardened, the scar on his jaw tightening as he looked out over the empty horizon. When he looked back at her, his voice held the weight of an iron anvil. "I ain't a peddler, and I don't buy or sell human lives," he said, each word deliberate and sharp. "A person's dignity ain't a commodity to be bartered in the desert. You're a human being stranded in the dirt, and leaving you here would be a sin I ain't minded to carry. The water is free. The ride is free. The choice is entirely yours." Abby looked at the endless, shimmering desert, then looked at the calloused, open hand Silas extended toward her. For the first time in a very long time, someone was looking at her and seeing a person, not a piece of property. Slowly her fingers uncurled. The jagged piece of flint thudded into the red dust. The heat waves didn't just rise from the earth. They danced. They twisted the horizon into a jagged, broken line that made a person doubt their own eyes. Silas Woodward's horse walked with a slow, rhythmic swing. Thud-clop, thud-clop. It was a steady sound. It was the only sound under that massive, burning sky. Abby sat behind him, her hands lightly gripping the rough wool of his vest. She was acutely aware of the solid warmth of the man, the way his back muscles shifted under his faded blue shirt with every stride of the buckskin. "We'll hit the creek bed in an hour," Silas said. He didn't turn his head. He just let his voice drift back over his shoulder. "Water's slow this time of year, but it's sweet enough if you dig past the sand." Abby did answer right away. Her throat felt like it was lined with corn husks. She licked her dry lips. "I can wait." Silas reached down to his saddle horn. He untied a heavy leather water skin and passed it back to her without a word. Abby took it. Her hands were still trembling slightly. She uncorked the wooden plug and took a small, Careful sip. The water was warm. It tasted of old leather and wood smoke. To her it tasted like life itself. She wanted to guzzle the whole skin. She wanted to let it pour down her neck and soak her ruined yellow dress. But she stopped. She put the plug back in. She knew the rules of the dry country. Even if she was from the green hills of Boston. You don't waste. You don't take more than your share when tomorrow isn't promised. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me for water. Miss Vance. Silas grunted. The buckskin stepped over a fallen mesquite branch. God put it in the ground. I just happened to scoop it up. A man who charges for a drink of water in a desert. Well, he has got a rot in his soul. They rode in silence for another mile. The red dirt slowly gave way to yellow clay. The prickly pear grew thicker, their flat green pads bristling with pale needles. Then the horse stopped. Its ears twitched forward. Abby looked over Silas' broad shoulder. Coming down the wash ahead of them was a lone rider. The mule he rode was a rib-thin, miserable creature, its head hanging low. The man in the saddle was small, wire-thin, and wore a greasy canvas coat despite the blistering heat. A large wooden crate was strapped to the mule's pack saddle, jingling with the sound of glass bottles. It was the border peddler. He pulled his mule to a halt 5 paces away. His face was a map of dark wrinkles and bad teeth. He looked at Silas. Then his yellowed eyes slid over to Abby. A slow, greasy grin spread across his face. Well now, Woodward. The peddler cackled. His voice sounded like dry gravel being turned over with a shovel. See, you found yourself some stray livestock out by the line. Abby felt her stomach tighten. Her fingers dug into Silas' vest. Silas didn't move. His hands stayed loose on the reins, resting just above the brass horn of his saddle. Mind your tongue. Miller, the lady isn't livestock. Lady. The peddler spit a dark stream of tobacco juice into the red dirt. It hissed against a hot stone. Looks like a runaway to me. Found her myself an hour before you did. Offered her a nice, cool swallow from my private jug. All she had to do was be real nice to a lonely man. But she went and pulled a rock on me. High mighty for a girl with no shoes. Abby's breath caught. She expected Silas to laugh. She expected him to look at her with that cold, assessing gaze her stepfather always used when a woman didn't behave. Instead, Silas' posture went dead still. The easy, swinging rhythm of his body vanished. He became like a block of granite. She pulled a rock because you forgot what it means to be a man, Silas said. His voice wasn't loud. It was low. It was the sound of a dark cloud rolling over a prairie. A woman's body belongs to her. Miller, it ain't a piece of meat to be traded for a drop of water. You leverage a person's thirst to take what ain't yours. That makes you less than a dog. The peddler's grin faltered. His hand twitched toward the small, rusted pocket pistol tucked into his waistband. He didn't make it halfway. Silas didn't draw his gun. He just cleared his coat tail away from the heavy Colt .45 riding on his hip. It was a smooth, casual movement, a silent statement. Go ahead and try. The peddler swallowed hard. His hand dropped back to his reins. Just making a joke. Woodward, no need to get your dander up. Out here on the line, nobody sells hope for free. A man's got to make a living. Then find a living that don't involve stepping on the weak, Silas said. He nudged the buckskin forward with his heels. Move that mule aside. Before I decide this trail is too narrow for the both of us. The peddler yanked his mule's head to the right, cursing under his breath. The thin beast scrambled up the sandy bank, loose gravel rattling down into the wash. As they passed, the peddler glared at Abby, a hateful, venomous look. But she didn't look down. She kept her chin up. She held on to Silas' vest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her knuckles. The wagon trail dipped down into a wide, dry creek bed shaded by a few ancient, twisted cottonwood trees. Their green leaves rattled in the hot wind like small coins. Silas swung out of the saddle in one fluid motion. His boots hit the sand with a soft thud. He reached up, his large, calloused hands capturing her waist. He lifted her down as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry wheat. He didn't linger. He didn't squeeze. The moment her bound feet touched the ground, his hands dropped away. Respect, it was in everything he did. "Sit under the shade," Silas ordered, pointing toward a massive gray root that curved out of the dirt like a bench. "The horse needs a blow." Abby walked over, her linen-wrapped feet sinking into the cool, damp sand beneath the surface. She sat. The shade felt like ice compared to the open flat. Silas walked a few paces away into the deepest part of the bend. He knelt, using his bare hands. He began to scoop out the coarse gray sand. He dug deep, his thick arms moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm. After a minute, the sand at the bottom of the hole grew dark. Then, a slow, murky pool of water began to seep up from the belly of the earth. He waited for the mud to settle. Then he took his Stetson, filled it with the clear water, and held it out to his horse. The buckskin drank with long, noisy swallows. Abby watched him. "You really don't believe in selling hope, do you, Mr. Woodward?" Silas wiped his wet hands on his trousers. He walked over and sat on the other end of the root, leaving a respectful 3 feet of space between them. He picked up a dry twig and broke it in half. Snap. "Hope ain't a sack of flour, Miss Vance," he said. He looked out at the shimmering flats beyond the trees. "You can't weigh it on a scale. You can't put a price tag on it. My father, he was a preacher back in Tennessee. He used to say that the moment you try to put a price on mercy, or freedom, or hope, you've turned God's grace into a swindle." He paused. He tossed the broken twig into the dry dirt. "Your stepfather, he thought he owned you. That peddler. He thought his water gave him the right to buy you. They're wrong. A human being is born free under the sun. The law in these parts might be slow to catch up to that truth, but the dirt don't care about their laws. Out here, you're just a soul. Same as me. Same as that horse." Abby felt a strange, tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. For 2 years, since her mother had died and her father had lost his mind to the grief, she had been told she was a burden, a mouth to feed, a debt to be paid. "Harlan said I was useless," she whispered. She looked down at her wrapped feet. "He said a woman with no money and no husband in this country is just dead weight." Silas snorted. It was a sharp, angry sound. "Harlan Vance is a fool. In this territory, we don't need titles, and we don't need gold to be worth something. We need people who can look at a hard day and not break. You walked out of that desert with your head up, Miss Vance. You didn't lay down for that peddler, and you didn't cry for your deucer. That tells me all I need to know about your weight." He stood up, dusting off his knees. The shadow of his hat covered his face again, but his gray eyes were bright. "The horse is rested," Silas said, his drawl returning to its easy, conversational cadence. "Let's get you home. Juanita's going to have a fit when she sees what that sun did to your skin." Abby stood up. Her feet stung, but the pain felt different now. It didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like a reminder that she was still here. She was still walking. She took Silas' hand as he helped her back onto the horse. His grip was firm, dry, and certain. As the buckskin moved out of the timber and back into the sun, Abby looked back at the crossroads behind them. The red dust had settled. The road was empty. The past was back there, frying in the heat. Ahead of them, the trail wound upward toward the foothills, where the grass began to grow. The sun was dropping low when the Woodward Ranch finally came into view. It sat in a wide, green bowl where two low hills met, protected from the worst of the north wind. It wasn't a grand estate. There were no white pillars or painted fences like the houses Abby had seen in the valleys of Virginia. It was built of thick, hand-hewn cedar logs and heavy mountain stone. The roof was low and sod-covered, blending right into the hillside. Long corrals made of peeled pine poles spread out behind the main house, where 100 head of red and white cattle stood waiting for the evening feed. But it was clean. The dirt in the yard was swept. A massive stone chimney threw a thin, lazy ribbon of blue wood smoke into the purple twilight sky. As the buckskin stallion walked into the yard, the kitchen door swung open. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was short, sturdy, and wore a bright blue apron over a dark wool skirt. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, streaked with silver at the temples, and pulled back into a tight, sensible bun. She held a heavy wooden spoon in her right hand like a scepter. "Silas," she called out. Her voice was sharp, carrying across the yard with a thick, musical accent. "You are late. The stew is all ready." She stopped. Her dark eyes locked onto Abby sitting behind the saddle. Silas pulled the horse to a halt by the hitching rail. "Evening. Juanita. Found a traveler on the Otero Trail. This is Miss Abigail Vance." Juanita didn't hesitate. She dropped her spoon onto a porch table and marched down the steps. Her face, which had been pinched with irritation, softened into a look of fierce, motherly concern the moment she saw Abby's sunburned face and the stained, torn yellow dress. "Dios mío," Juanita muttered, reaching up to help Abby down. Her hands were small, but they had the strength of an ox. "Look at you. Pobrecita. The sun has cooked you alive. Silas, you big mule. Why did you let her ride in this heat without a hat?" "She didn't have one when I found her." "Juanita," Silas said mildly, dismounting and unlooping his saddlebags. "Men," Juanita spat, but there was no real venom in it. She put her arm around Abby's waist, supporting her weight. "Come inside. Child, do not mind the smell of the sheep. We have real food here." As they crossed the yard, two men emerged from the large timber barn. One was a tall, lean black man with a silver dollar scar on his cheek, wearing a pair of patched canvas trousers and a clean white shirt. The other was a younger man, his skin the color of old copper, with long black hair tied back with a strip of deer hide, and Apache. Abby froze for a fraction of a second. In Boston, the newspaper spoke of the frontier as a place of constant war, whites against blacks, settlers against Indians. She had been taught that there was an order to the world, a strict hierarchy that kept everyone in their proper place. But here the black man simply nodded to Silas. "Evening, boss. The bay mare's leg is looking better. We put some of that blue salve on it." "Good work, Caleb," Silas said, tossing him the stallion's reins. "Give the buckskin an extra scoop of grain tonight. He earned it." The Apache youth didn't speak, but he caught Silas's eye and gave a brief, respectful nod before heading toward the woodpile. There was no bowing. There was no shuffling of feet. They spoke to Silas like men speaking to another man. Equal Juanita saw Abby watching them. She gave Abby's waist a gentle squeeze. "A strange house." "No," Juanita murmured as she guided her up the porch steps. "In town they call this the outcast nest. They think Silas is crazy for paying good silver to anyone who can ride a horse. But a man's skin don't herd cattle. Chica, his heart does." The inside of the main house was cool and dimly lit. The air smelled of roasted beef, dried chilas, and pine tar. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by two long oak tables that looked like they had been built to survive an earthquake. Juanita led Abby down a short, dark hallway to a small door at the very end. She pushed it open. The room was tiny, but it was clean. It held a narrow iron bedstead with a thick feather mattress, a simple pine washstand with a white ceramic basin, and a single small window that looked out toward the dark hills. Silas appeared in the doorway behind them. He carried a heavy iron key in his hand. He didn't step into the room. He stayed in the hall, his broad frame nearly filling the space. He held the key out to Abby. "This is your place for now, Miss Vance," Silas said. His voice was quiet, respectful of the threshold. "The lock works from the inside. Nobody comes in this room without your leave. Not me, not the hands. Your privacy is your own." Abby took the cold iron key. Her fingers brushed against his calloused palm. "Thank you, Mr. Woodward. Juanita will bring you some water to wash up, and some clothes that'll fit better than that Boston silk," Silas said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Take your time. We don't formalize things much here, but we eat when the food is hot." He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan. Juanita disappeared for a minute, returning with a steaming tin bucket of hot water and a large, soft white towel. She set them on the washstand, along with a simple, clean dress made of dark brown homespun cotton. "It was my daughter's," Juanita said softly, her dark eyes growing distant for a second. "She did not survive the winter 3 years ago, the fever. But it is a good dress. Strong, it will keep the sun off your arms." Abby looked at the dress, then at the older woman. "I am sorry for your loss." "Juanita, Juanita smiled, a sad but warm expression that creased her whole face. The desert takes, child, but it also gives. Now wash that red dirt off your face. It belongs to the trail, not to you. When Juanita closed the door, Abby was alone. She turned the heavy iron key in the lock. The mechanism clicked into place with a solid, reassuring clack. She stripped off her filthy, torn yellow dress. It felt like shedding an old skin. She dipped a cloth into the hot water and began to wash. She washed away the dust of the crossroads. She washed away the dried blood from her wrists where the ropes had chafed. As the warm water turned gray in the basin, she looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the stand. Her green eyes were tired. Her auburn hair was a tangled mess. But she didn't look broken. The girl in the mirror looked back at her with a steady, quiet resolve. She pulled the brown homespun dress over her head. It was a little loose in the waist, but the heavy fabric felt clean and solid against her skin. It had long sleeves that covered her sun-reddened arms, and the hem fell neatly to her ankles. She didn't have shoes, but Juanita had left a pair of thick, soft wool socks on the bed. She unlocked the door and stepped out into the main room. The long tables were now set with tin plates and large wooden bowls. Silas sat at the head of the center table. To his right sat Caleb, the Black Trail boss. To his left sat the Apache youth, whose name she learned was Taza. Juanita was busy ladling thick, dark beef stew into the plates. Abby hesitated at the edge of the room. In every house she had ever known, servants ate in the kitchen, laborers ate in the bunkhouse. The owner sat alone or with his family. Silas looked up. He stood up from his chair, a simple, natural movement of courtesy that none of her stepfather's wealthy friends would have offered a penniless girl. "We saved a spot for you, Miss Vance," Silas said, gesturing to an empty bench next to Juanita's chair. Abby walked over and sat down. The smell of the food made her stomach rumble audibly. Caleb smiled kindly, passing her a basket of warm, thick corn biscuits. "Eat up, Miss Abby," Caleb said. His voice was smooth and gentle. "Juanita's stew could bring a dead mule back to life. You need to put some wood on the fire after that ride." "Thank you, Mr. Just Caleb." "Ma'am," he said, nodding. "Out here. We leave the misters back across the river. It's too hot for extra syllables." As they ate, the conversation drifted naturally. They talked about the cattle, the price of salt blocks in town, and a fence line that needed mending before the mountain cattle started drifting down for the winter. There was no shouting. There was no posturing. Every man spoke with the quiet confidence of someone whose labor was valued. Abby watched them, her heart feeling fuller than it had in years. She looked at Silas, who was listening intently to Caleb describe a broken spring head in the north pasture. This wasn't just a ranch. It was an island, a place where the rules of the old world had been thrown into the fire, and something new, something honest, had been built from the ashes. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if her stepfather would come looking for her, or if she could ever truly find a place in this wild, unforgiving country. But as she took a bite of the warm biscuit and felt the gentle, rhythmic hum of the house around her, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't dead weight. Not here. The dawn didn't ask if you were tired. It just cracked open the eastern sky with a sliver of cold, pale light and left you to deal with it. Abby woke up before the rooster finished his first crow. Her body felt like it had been pounded by a railroad mallet. Every muscle from her lower back to her shoulder blades was locked tight from the previous day's ride. But she didn't stay in bed. She turned the heavy iron key, stepped out into the cool dark of the main house, and found Juanita already throwing split cedar into the belly of the big iron cook stove. "Ah, the bird is out of the nest," Juanita murmured. She didn't look up from her work. She slammed the iron stove lid down with a sharp clank. "Good, the boys will be coming in from the dawn milking in 30 minutes. They eat like wolves, chica." Grab that sack of flour. That morning was a lesson in survival. Abby had never handled a cast iron skillet the size of a wagon wheel. She didn't know how to gauge the heat of a wood fire by holding her bare palm above the iron. Juanita didn't offer pity, and she didn't offer soft words. She just showed. "Not like that." Juanita grunted. tapping Abby's wrist with a wooden spoon as Abby tried to stir the heavy lard into the flour. You treat the dough like it's an enemy. Light hands. Abigail, if you fight the flour, the biscuit will turn to stone in the baking. A good cook doesn't force the food. She works with it. By noon, Abby's hands were white with flour up to her elbows. Her face was flushed red from the stove's breath, and her lower back was a steady, throbbing ache. But when the hands filed in for the midday meal, the platters were piled high with golden, flaky biscuit, thick brown gravy. The men sat down at the long oak table. Silas sat at the head, his gray eyes quiet, watching the way Abby moved around the room. He didn't say anything, but he gave her a brief nod when she set a fresh pot of black coffee near his elbow. The kitchen door rattled open, and a new man stepped inside. He was a drifter Silas had hired 3 days ago out of Otero, a lean, cynical-looking man named Hank with a sour mouth and a pair of cold, restless eyes. He had a reputation for being fast with a rope and faster with an excuse. He threw his greasy hat onto a corner bench, sat down hard at the lower end of the table, and looked at the platter of food. Then his eyes slid over to Abby, who was wiping down the side counters. Hank snatched 3 biscuits, splitting one open with a dirty thumb. He looked up at Silas. "Hey, Woodward," Hank said, his voice carrying a sharp, unpleasant edge across the quiet room. "I was looking over the ledger book Caleb had out on the porch before dinner. I noticed something that don't sit right with me." Silas didn't stop chewing. He swallowed his food, took a slow sip of his coffee, and set the tin cup down with a soft thud. "Is that so?" "Hank." "Yeah," Hank said, leaning forward, his elbows planting heavy on the oak table. "It says that housegirl yonder is down for a full share of the weekly payroll. Same as me. Same as Caleb." The room went dead quiet. Caleb stopped his fork halfway to his mouth. Taza kept his eyes fixed on his plate, his posture freezing like a hawk on a branch. Hank snorted, tossing the biscuit back onto his plate. "Now I ain't one to complain about a man as charity. If you want to keep a pretty bird in the house and feed her, that's your business. But a common housegirl getting the same silver as a man who spends 10 hours a day in a hot saddle, chasing wild steers through the brush. Well, that ain't right. It ain't natural. A man's labor ought to mean something more than a woman scrubbing pots." Abby felt the blood rush to her face. Her fingers gripped the damp dishcloth so hard her knuckles turned white. The old familiar shame, the same feeling her stepfather had beaten into her for 2 years, grew like a cold lump in her throat. She expected Silas to tell her to go to her room. She expected him to compromise, to keep the peace with his working hands. Instead, Silas reached out, picked up his empty coffee tin, and dropped it onto the center of the table. Bang! The sound echoed off the log walls like a rifle shot. The tin cup rattled against the wood and fell on its side. Silas didn't jump. He didn't shout. He just leaned forward, his massive shoulders blocking out the light from the kitchen window, his gray eyes locking onto Hank with the weight of a falling timber. "On this grass, Hank, we don't measure a soul's value by the shape of their shadow," Silas said. His voice was low, slow and completely devoid of heat, which made it 10 times more dangerous. "And we don't measure a day's work by whether it's done in a saddle or over a hot iron stove." Hank swallowed, his sour confidence wavering under that heavy gaze. "Now hold on, Woodward. I just meant I know what you meant." Silas cut him off, his drawl cutting through the room like a sharp knife. "You think because Miss Vance doesn't wear spurs, her time don't have a price. You think because her labor keeps this house running, keeps the clothes clean, and puts fuel in your belly so you don't starve on the trail, that it's somehow free. You're wrong." Silas stood up. He didn't reach for his gun, but his presence filled the kitchen until Hank looked small sitting on his bench. "Every soul that drops sweat for the Woodward name gets their fare. Equal due," Silas said, each word hitting the table like a hammer on an iron wedge. "A person's dignity ain't something you discount because they don't look like you, or talk like you, or work the same job as you. Miss Vance gives this ranch her labor. She gives it her loyalty. That means she earns her silver, dollar for dollar, the same as any trail boss or top hand. If your pride is too fragile to eat at a table where everyone is paid their honest worth, Then you can draw your time right now and find a trail that suits your notions. There's the door. Hank stared at his plate. His face turned a deep, mottled red. He didn't reach for his hat, and he didn't head for the door. He knew there wasn't another spread within 50 miles that paid a fair wage or provided a roof that didn't leak. "I'll keep my saddle," Hank muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on his gravy. "Then eat your dinner and mind your manners," Silas said, sitting back down and picking up his fork as if nothing had happened. "Juanita, we could use some more of that pepper sauce if you're minded to pass it." The meal finished in a quiet, orderly rhythm. One by one, the hands stood up, tipped their hats to Juanita and Abby, and walked out to the corrals. Hank was the first out the door, his spurs clinking a fast, hurried tune across the porch. When the room was empty save for the two of them, Abby walked over to the head of the table to clear Silas' plate. Her hands were still a little unsteady, but the cold lump in her throat was gone. It had been replaced by something warm, something steady and strong. "You didn't have to do that, Mr. Woodward," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the hum of the stove. "I could have ignored him. I've heard worse." Silas didn't look up right away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of pine and his pocket knife, and began to shave off a thin sliver of wood. Whittle, whittle. A man who stays quiet when another person's worth is being dragged through the dirt. He's just as guilty as the gan doing the dragging. "Miss Vance," Silas said. He looked up, his gray eyes clear and steady. "An old friend of mine, a man who wore the same blue coat I did during the war, he used to say that freedom ain't something you just keep for yourself. If you don't protect the rights of the person sitting next to you, then your own freedom is just a lie you tell yourself until the wind changes." Hank needed to learn that truth. This ranch don't harbor tyrants, big or small. He stood up, putting his knife away. "You made a good biscuit today, Abby," he added, using her name for the first time without the formal prefix. "Don't let any man tell you it wasn't earned." He walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving Abby standing by the long oak table. She looked down at her calloused hands, stained with flour and lard. They didn't look like a burden anymore. They looked like the hands of a person who belonged. The storm came down from the northern peaks without an hour's warning. By midnight, the wind was howling through the cedar trees like a lost hound, and a heavy, blinding rain was hammering against the sod roof of the main house. The timber logs groaned under the pressure, and the thunder rolled across the valley in long, deafening explosions that shook the glass in the window frames. Inside, the lights had failed. The oil lamps were dry, and the darkness was thick enough to feel. Abby woke to the sound of a shutter banging violently against the outside wall of the horse barn. Slam, crack, slam. She knew the wind would rip the iron hinges right out of the pine if it wasn't secured. She put on her wool socks, threw a heavy canvas slicker over her homespun dress, and stepped out into the main room with a small, sputtering candle held in her palm. The house was empty. Silas was likely out in the corrals with Caleb, trying to keep the young calves from smothering each other against the mud fences. She made her way down the back hallway toward the utility porch, searching for the large tin of kerosene and a fresh box of matches. Her candle flickered, casting long, jumping shadows against the log walls. In the corner of the back pantry, behind a stack of empty grain sacks, her foot struck something hard and metallic. Thunk, she knelt down, holding the candle close. It wasn't a kerosene tin. It was a massive, old iron-bound cedar chest, covered in a thick layer of dust and grease. The lock was heavy, rusty and broken, forced open long ago by a crowbar or an iron wedge. Abby shouldn't have looked. She knew it wasn't her business. But the lid was slightly askew, and beneath the wood smell, a strange, sharp scent drifted up, the smell of old copper, dried ink, and black gunpowder. Her fingers touched the heavy lid. It lifted with a slow, agonizing creak. Inside, wrapped in a faded blue cavalry cloak, lay a collection of things that didn't belong to a peaceful rancher. There was a heavy brass-hilted saber, its blade dark with old oil and notched near the tip. There was a leather-bound journal with its pages water-stained and warped. and beneath the journal lay a thick stack of official-looking papers, pinned together with a rusted iron clip. Abby lifted the papers, holding the candle closer to the faded, elegant handwriting. Military Department of the Southwest, 1,864. Her eyes scanned the lines. It wasn't a ledger of cattle or a record of land sales. It was a list of execution orders, military court-martials from the dark days of the Civil War, names of deserters, spies and bushwhackers, each one signed with a heavy, authoritative hand at the bottom of the page. Sentence carried out by Cavalry Detachment 4. Silas Woodward, commanding. Abby's breath caught in her throat. The candle wax dripped onto her thumb, hot and stinging, but she didn't feel it. Her mind raced back to the stories she had read in Boston stories of the ruthless enforcer units that hunted men through the swamps and mountains. Men who carried out the law without mercy, without a trial, leaving nothing but shallow graves in the woods. Was Silas one of them? Was the man who had given her a key? The man who spoke of dignity and equal rights? Nothing more than a cold-blooded killer hiding from his own past. "You're looking at a graveyard, Miss Vance." The voice came out of the dark behind her. Abby jumped, her hand convulsing as the candle fell into the dirt floor and went out. The darkness rushed back in, black as ink. The only light came from the jagged flashes of lightning through the pantry window, illuminating the tall, dripping wet silhouette standing in the doorway. Silas. He had his slicker off, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. The pale scar on his jaw looked white and stark against his skin in the lightning flashes. He didn't move toward her. He just stood there, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his chest heaving from the work outside. Abby backed up against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I was looking for the kerosene. Mr. Woodward, I didn't mean to. I know what you were looking for," Silas said. His voice was raw. It sounded like it had been dragged over rough gravel. "And I know what you found." He walked into the pantry, his heavy boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He knelt down beside the cedar chest. In the next flash of lightning, Abby saw his hands, the big, powerful hands that had carved her a home, reach into the box and lift the stack of faded papers. "They call it a war ledger," Silas whispered, his drawl disappearing into a hard, rhythmic cadence that sounded like a soldier marching. "But it's just a count of the dead. My unit, we were tasked with keeping the lines clean behind the main army. That meant hunting the men who broke their oaths. Deserters. Guerrillas who burned homes and killed women while the regular troops were away fighting at the front." He stopped. The thunder broke directly overhead, a massive, splitting roar that made the logs tremble. Silas didn't blink. He kept his eyes fixed on the papers in his hand. "I thought I was doing the law's work," he said, his voice dropping so low Abby had to lean forward to hear it over the rain. "I thought because a politician in a clean suit signed his name at the bottom of a ledger, it made the killing righteous. We hunted a boy once no older than Taza is now. A deserter who just wanted to go home to his mother's farm because his father had died of the smallpox. We caught him in the cedar breaks. I had the order. I had the pen. I carried out the sentence." He looked up at Abby, his gray eyes dark with a torment that had been burning inside him for 12 years. "When the war ended, I realized the truth," Silas said, his hand trembling slightly as he dropped the papers back into the chest. "The law doesn't make a man righteous. Abby, a man can use a badge, or a flag, or a legal document to strip another human being of their life, their freedom, and their dignity, and call it justice. I spent 4 years helping destroy lives because the ledger told me to. When I took off that blue coat, I swore an oath to the only judge that matters, my own soul. I came out here to this grass to build something different, a place where a person's life belongs to them, not to a state, and not to a piece of paper." The silence returned to the room, heavy and thick, broken only by the steady tap-tap-tap of the rain on the roof. Abby looked at the big man kneeling in the dirt. The fear that had gripped her a minute ago vanished, replaced by a deep, aching comprehension. She understood the scar on his face now, and she understood the sanctuary he had built. He wasn't a saint. He was a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity, including his own capacity for cruelty, and had chosen to spend the rest of his days fighting for the light. She didn't run out of the pantry. She didn't call him a murderer. Slowly, Abby stepped forward and knelt in the dirt beside him. She reached out her hand, the hand that was now calloused from working his kitchen, and placed it gently over his scarred knuckles. His skin was ice cold from the rain. My father used to say that a man's life isn't judged by where he starts the trail. Silas, she said softly, her voice steady and warm in the dark. It's judged by the direction he's walking when the sun goes down. You can't change the names in that ledger. But you changed my name from dead weight to a person with a future. That counts for something. In any book that matters. Silas stayed still for a long time, looking at her hand resting on his. Then, slowly, he let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a prayer. He turned his hand over, his thick fingers wrapping around hers in a brief, firm grip of mutual understanding. "Let's get that shutter fixed," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, gravelly drawl as he stood up, "before the wind takes the whole barn." He closed the lid of the cedar chest with a soft, final click, pushing it back into the shadows behind the sacks. As they walked out into the main room, a fresh flash of lightning lit up the kitchen tables, clean and ready for the morning breakfast. The ghosts were still in the box, but the house was secure. The town of Otero didn't have deep roots. It was just a jagged collection of unpainted pine boards, canvas-topped saloons, and red dirt streets that smelled of stale beer, mule manure, and greed. It grew up around the silver mines in the foothills, and like anything built on quick money, it lacked a soul. The law here didn't live in a textbook. It lived in the pocket of whoever owned the richest vein in the mountain. Silas drove the supply wagon with his usual unhurried rhythm. Creak, clack, creak. The heavy wooden wheels groaned under a load of salt blocks, sacks of green coffee, and bolts of dark wool that Juanita had requested for the winter sewing. Abby sat beside him on the high spring seat, her hands folded neatly over her brown homespun dress. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat Juanita had found in an old pantry trunk. The shade felt cool against her cheeks. For the first time in months, she was back in civilization. But as she watched the drifters, the miners, and the slick-haired gamblers loitering on the boardwalks, she didn't feel a longing for the town. She felt an ache for the quiet timbers of the Woodward place. "We load the iron spikes at the blacksmith's. Then we redone," Silas said, letting his gaze wander casually over the hitching rails. "Town's crowded today. Silver train must be rolling out tomorrow." Abby nodded, watching a young Mexican boy trying to lead a heavy wood cart through the muddy ruts of the main street. A freighter in a flashy leather coat yelled an oath, swinging a heavy leather whip toward the boy's mule to force him off the path. The boy scrambled into the muck, his eyes wide with fear. Silas didn't pull his team to a halt, but his jaw went tight. "See that, Abby? A town like this, it forgets that every man walks the earth on the same level. They think because a boy speaks a different tongue or drives a poor mule, he's just dirt to be kicked aside. It's a sickness." They pulled up in front of the general store. Ceaseless swung down, his heavy boots hitting the dirt boardwalk with a solid thud. He turned to help Abby, his large hands gripping her waist with that same respectful, brief touch she had come to rely on. As her feet hit the wood planks, a sharp, familiar laugh cut through the noise of the street. Ha ha ha, it was a wet, rattling sound, the sound of an old throat full of phlegm and malice. Abby froze. The blood in her veins turned to liquid ice. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. She knew the rhythm of those heavy, silver-spurred boots. Harlan Vance stepped out of the shadow of the Lone Star Saloon. He hadn't changed. He wore the same grease-stained black broadcloth suit, the same silk vest with the gold watch chain he'd won in a poker game in San Antonio, and the same cold, calculating eyes of a butcher looking over a fence. Behind him walked two men, lean, thuggish drifters with low-slung iron on their hips and the restless, hungry look of hired wolves. "Well, look at what the desert kept alive," Harlan purred, stepping into the center of the boardwalk, blocking their path to the store door. "I told the boys you were too stubborn to die. Abigail, looks like I was right." Abby backed up a half step, her back hitting the rough timber of the supply wagon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't look down. "Harlan, that's a father to you." "Girl," Harlan said, his eyes sliding over her brown dress. Noting the calluses on her fingers, he snorted. "Look at you, wearing rags, working like a common field hand. I raised you for better things. Abigail, I had a fine arrangement for you back in Texas. Before you went and played the outlaw." Silas stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon, but he moved his large body between Harlan and Abby, casting a long, dark shadow over her stepfather. "The lady's name is Miss Vance," Mr. Silas said, his deep drawl dropping into that slow, dangerous register Abby had heard in the kitchen. "And she don't belong to you." Harlan's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixing the pale scar on Silas's jaw. He took a slow, deliberate look at the heavy Colt .45 riding on Silas's hip. "And who might you be?" "The man who stole my property. My name is Silas Woodward," the big man said, his arms hanging loose at his sides. "And I don't see any property here. Just a free woman." "Free," Harlan laughed. A loud, ugly sound that made a couple of miners stop on the boardwalk to watch. "The territory law says different. Woodward, her father died in debt to my name. I hold the legal guardianship papers signed by a judge in Bexar County. She's a minor under the ledger of the law, and she's an indentured dependent until she's 21 or married with my consent. I already sold her contract to Old Man Miller up at the silver mine. $300. Coin he's waiting for his bride." A local marshal, a thick-waisted man with a tarnished silver star pinned to his greasy vest, walked out of the saloon behind Harlan's men. He bit into a plug of tobacco, looking at Silas with a lazy, corrupt eye. "He's got the papers." "Woodward," the marshal said, his voice thick with saloon smoke. "I seen 'em. The law says the girl goes with her legal kin. A man's got a right to his household dependents. You better step aside before you get yourself crossways with the county." Abby felt the world spinning. The red dirt street, the blue sky, the ugly pine buildings, it all felt like a trap closing in on her. The law, the legal papers. The same system that had stripped her father of his store when he was dead was now coming to strip her of her soul. Harlan reached out a hand, his dirty fingernails twitching toward Abby's wrist. "Come along, Abigail. Don't make the boys use the leather." Silas didn't wait. He didn't shout. His left hand shot out like a striking rattler. He caught Harlan by the throat of his silk vest, lifted him 6 inches off the wooden boardwalk, and slammed him back against the heavy timber post of the store porch. Crack! Harlan's hat flew into the dirt. His breath came out in a sharp, terrified wheeze. The 2 hired guns instinctively reached for their pistols. But before their fingers could clear the leather, they heard the heavy, metallic click-clack of Silas' Colt .45. Silas hadn't even looked at them. His right hand held the iron steady, the long barrel pointing directly at the marshal's thick belly. "Nobody moves an inch," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud. It was dead silent. It was the sound of a winter freeze locking a river. "Marshal, you tell your boys to keep their hands off their iron, or you going to be the first man to see what the inside of this barrel looks like." The marshal went white. His hands stayed flat against his suspenders. "Easy now, Woodward. I'm just stating the statute." Silas turned his gray eyes back to Harlan, whose face was turning a dark, mottled purple under the grip of Silas's left hand. Silas brought his face inches from Harlan's nose. "You listen to me. You piece of carrion," Silas whispered, each word cutting through the quiet street like an axe into cedar. "Your legal ledgers might call a woman property in Texas. Your corrupt judges might sign a piece of parchment that says you can trade a human soul for 300 pieces of silver. But the Almighty didn't build this girl with a deed attached to her back. She ain't a cow you can sell, and she ain't a claim you can stake. She's a human being, free under the sun, and she's a working hand on the Woodward Ranch." He let go of Harlan's vest, letting the older man drop into a heap on the wood planks. Harlan coughed, clutching his throat, his eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror. Silas stepped back, keeping his Colt pointed at the 3 men. He didn't look at Abby, but his drawl was steady as a rock. "Get on the wagon." Abby didn't hesitate. She climbed up the iron wheel, her brown dress tearing slightly on the brake lever, and grabbed the reins. Silas slowly backed up toward the spring seat, his eyes never leaving the marshal and Harlan's regulators. He swung up into the saddle beside her with one fluid, powerful motion, his left hand taking the reins from her fingers. "We leaving town now, Marshal," Silas said, looking down at the lawman. "If Harlan wants to test his papers on my grass, you tell him to bring enough men to fill a ditch, because the law of the Woodward place says every soul stays free, and I got 40 grains of powder to back that law up." He cracked the whip over the team. The horses dug their hooves into the red muck, and the heavy supply wagon lunged forward, leaving Harlan Vance coughing in the dust of the street. As the town of Otero disappeared behind the foothills, Abby looked at Silas. His face was set like stone, the pale scar on his jaw twitching with a silent fury. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. But she knew one thing for certain. The paper didn't own her. The ledger was broken. The night was cold enough to turn a man's breath to silver. A high white moon sat over the valley, casting long, stark shadows across the peeled pine corrals of the Woodward place. Inside the main house, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing red coals, throwing a faint, bloody light across the long oak tables. Abby sat by the hearth, a heavy wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She couldn't sleep. The silence of the prairie felt dangerous tonight, like a breath being held before a scream. Suddenly, the buckskin stallion in the south corral let out a sharp, whistling snort. Whoo, huff. Then came the low, rhythmic rattle of loose gravel moving down the ridge path. Silas was out of his chair before the sound finished. He didn't have his boots on, but his heavy Winchester rifle was already in his hand, the lever moving with a quiet, oily slide click. "Caleb," Silas called out into the dark of the kitchen. The door to the back porch opened, and Caleb stepped inside. He had a double-barreled shotgun broke open over his arm, his face grim in the moonlight. "They're coming down the cedar break, boss." Counted 6 riders. "They ain't trying to hide their tracks." "Harlan," Abby whispered, her throat tightening. Silas walked over to her. He didn't tell her to hide in the root cellar. He didn't treat her like a child. He reached into his belt, pulled out a small, nickel-plated Remington pocket pistol, and placed the cold iron handle into her palm. 6 shots. "Abby," Silas said, his gray eyes locking onto hers in the dark. "The pull is heavy, but it fires true. If they get past the porch, you use it. You have a right to defend your own life. Don't you forget that." Abby took the gun. The metal felt heavy and real. "I won't forget." Bang! A rifle shot shattered the glass in the front window. A long shard of mirror silver fell into the hearth, hissing against the coals. Outside, a harsh, drunken voice yelled through the dark. "Woodward, bring out the girl and we leave your cattle alive. Otherwise, we re-burning the whole nest." "That's Hank's voice," Caleb muttered from the kitchen window, his shotgun barrel sliding through a gun slot in the log wall. "The drifter we let go last week. He knows the layout of the yard. He knows the layout, but he don't know the people," Silas said. He stepped out onto the front porch, the shadow of the roof covering his face as he dropped to one knee behind a heavy oak firewood box. The battle came down like a landslide. Harlan's men fired from behind the pine corrals, their Winchester rifles flashing in the white moonlight like angry fireflies. Pop, pop, pop. Bang, lead bullets tore into the cedar logs of the house, spraying showers of dry wood splinters through the broken window. Silas fired back with a slow, methodical rhythm. Crack, pause, crack every time his Winchester spoke. A rider behind the fence yelled or scrambled for better cover. He didn't waste lead. He shot like a man doing a hard day's chore. From the back corral, fresh volley of gunfire erupted, but it wasn't coming from Harlan's regulators. It was Taza. The Apache youth had crawled through the deep irrigation ditch behind the barn, his old Spencer carbine barking from the dark of the hayloft. To his left, Juanita was standing at the wash house door, a heavy iron horse pistol in her hand, firing into the brush to keep the attackers from flanking the porch. Abby watched through the broken window. She saw Caleb take a ball through the fleshy part of his thigh. He stumbled, his shotgun clattering against the floorboards, blood soaking through his white shirt. "Caleb!" she cried. She didn't stay in the corner. Abby dropped the blanket, crawled across the splintered floorboards on her hands and knees, and dragged Caleb back against the stone fireplace. She took her apron, tearing the stout linen with her teeth, and bound the wound tight, pinning it with her fingers to stop the red flow. "You're a good girl, Miss Abby," Caleb gasped, his teeth chattering from the shock. "Don't let 'em take you." Outside, the gunfire slackened. Harlan's men were losing their nerve. They hadn't expected a fight like this. They had thought the Black Hands and the Indian boy would run the moment the lead started flying. They didn't understand that these people weren't fighting for Silas Silver. They were fighting for the only piece of ground in the territory that treated them like human beings. Then came a heavy, rushing sound from the porch. Hank, the cynical drifter, had crawled under the floorboards. He leaped over the firewood box, his heavy Bowie knife flashing in the moonlight as he slammed into Silas from behind. The two men went down in a heap of dust and flying gravel. Silas' rifle flew off the porch, clattering into the yard. "I got him, Harlan," Hank yelled, his knee pinning Silas' wounded shoulder to the planks. He raised the long knife, the silver blade catching the white light of the moon. "Bring the rope." Silas fought with the strength of a grizzly, but his arm was pinned, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. Abby didn't think. She didn't look for a man to save her. She stood up from Caleb's side. She walked straight to the broken window frame, her homespun dress catching on the jagged glass. She raised the small Remington pocket pistol with both hands, the way her father had taught her to hold a dueling iron back in Boston. She took a slow breath. Pause. Bang. The small gun barked with a sharp, high report. The lead ball caught Hank square in the meat of his right forearm. The long knife flew from his fingers, spinning into the dirt yard. Hank let out a high, womanish shriek, clutching his bleeding arm as he rolled off Silas and tumbled down the porch steps into the mud. "Harlan," Hank screamed, scrambling on his knees toward the corrals. "The girl's got iron. She's crazy." That was the end of it. The remaining regulators, seeing their top man bleeding and hearing the steady, relentless fire from Taza Hayloft, turned their horses and bolted into the cedar breaks, their hooves clattering away into the dark. Silas crawled back onto the porch, his face covered in dirt and blood, his breath coming in long, heavy heaves. He looked through the broken window frame at Abby. She was still standing there, the small nickel pistol held steady in her hand, a thin wisp of blue smoke curling from the barrel. The valley went quiet again. The moon sat high and white over the red dirt yard, looking down on the brass casings littered across the planks like dropped coins. Silas slowly got to his feet, his hand gripping his bruised shoulder. He walked into the house, his boots crunching on the broken glass. He stopped 2 paces from her, his gray eyes looking at her with a look that was pure, undisguised reverence. "You fired a true shot, Abby," he said, his gravelly drawl thick with emotion. Abby let her hands drop cold now. "He was going to kill you, Silas. I couldn't let him take the house." "He wasn't just trying to take the house," Silas said, stepping closer, his large hand gently taking the pistol from her fingers and slipping it into his belt. He looked out the window at Caleb, who was sitting up against the hearth, and at Taza walking out of the barn with his rifle low. "They came to take our freedom," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "But they found out something the law books never teach. When you give a person their dignity, they'll fight for it. Every single time." The sun didn't rush itself. It crawled up over the eastern ridge like a slow, bloody hand, painting the smoke-filled valley in shades of bruised purple and heavy gold. Inside the main house, the smell of burnt black powder hung thick in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of copper from Caleb's leg and the sweet aroma of pine wood tar. The broken glass on the floor looked like spilled ice in the early light. Silas sat on a low bench by the window, his heavy blue shirt pulled down past his left shoulder. A long, dark purple bruise was already blooming across his skin where Hank's boot had caught him during the struggle on the porch. He didn't flinch. He didn't make a sound. He just watched Abby as she moved back and forth between the hearth and the table, her dark brown homespun dress swishing against the wood planks. She carried a tin basin of hot water and a clean strip of white cotton. Her hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped the moment the last horse hoof echoed away into the cedar brakes. "Hold still," she murmured, dipping the cloth into the steaming water. Silas let out a low, gravelly breath. "I'm still, Abby. Ain't got much choice. Body feels like a wagon ran over it." She pressed the warm cloth against the dried blood on his temple. He winced. Just a fraction. His gray eyes locking onto hers with a quiet, intense focus. Abby didn't look away. For months, she had looked at this man and seen a protector, a shield between her and a cruel world. But looking at the raw, split skin of his face, she saw something else. She saw a partner, someone who bled the same as she did. "Caleb's sleeping," Abby said, her voice low and rhythmic, keeping time with the steady drip of water back into the basin. Juanita gave him some of that bitter willow bark tea. The ball went straight through the meat. No bone broke. "Caleb's tough," Silas said, his drawl slow and thick with the exhaustion of the night. "He's carried worse lead than that. Back in '63. He took a mini ball to the ribs at Honey Springs. Stood his ground anyway. A man like that. You don't buy his loyalty with a handful of silver dollars, Abby. You earn it by standing beside him when the sky starts falling." Abby rinsed the cloth. The water in the tin basin turned a pale, watery pink. "He told me he stayed because of the name on the gate. He said you were the first man in the territory who didn't look at his hands and see a slave." "A man's hands belong to the man," Silas said. He looked down at his own thick, calloused fingers, resting heavy on his knee. "The law took 4 years of blood to write that truth down on a piece of parchment. But the parchment didn't make it real. We make it real. Every time we pull up a chair at that table. Every time we share the bread." He paused, a long, heavy silence settling between them as the morning wind rattled the loose tarp Caleb had nailed over the shattered window frame. "Harlan won't be back," Silas added quietly. Abby stopped her hand, the damp cloth hovering an inch from his scarred jaw. "How do you know?" "He's a stubborn man, Silas. He doesn't like losing a wager. He lost more than a wager last night," Silas said, a cold, hard edge returning to his gray eyes. "Taza found Hank crawling through the brush by the south fence an hour ago. His arms broke from your lead, and his mouth was wide open. Said a federal marshal out of Santa Fe dropped into town last night with a pocket full of warrants. Seems Harlan's guardianship papers weren't the only things he forged. He's been selling fraudulent timberland to some silver speculators from New York. The law's got him by the short hairs now." He reached up, his large, warm hand covering hers, gently guiding the cloth away from his face. "The trap's broken." "Abby," Silas whispered, his voice shaking just a fraction with an old, deep-seated emotion. "The ledger is closed. Nobody's coming to drag you down a red dirt road. Nobody's putting a price tag on your head again." Abby felt a strange, tight knot in her throat dissolve. Tears came to her eyes, not the hot, bitter tears of fear she had wept in Harlan's wagon, but a cool, cleansing rain that felt like dawn after a lifetime of dark. She looked out the broken window at the vast, green bowl of the valley, where the red and white cattle were already moving toward the creek. The grass looked bright. The sky looked endless. "I didn't think I'd ever see a day like this," she said, her voice catching in her chest. "A day where I didn't have to look over my shoulder." Silas stood up from the bench, his tall frame blocking out the pale morning sun. He didn't pull her into a tight embrace. He just stood close enough that you could feel the steady, rhythmic heat of him. He reached out, his thumb gently catching a stray tear as it rolled down her sun-reddened cheek. "The day I found you at that crossroads, Abby, I thought I was just doing a Christian chore," Silas said, his drawl soft and reverent. "I thought I was giving a poor, broken girl a place to hide until the weather cleared. But I was wrong. You didn't just hide on this ranch. You made it a home. You stood on that porch with iron in your hand, and you showed every hand on this spread that freedom ain't a gift you wait for. It's a boundary you draw in the dirt with your own blood." He took her hands, his grip firm and certain. "You belong here, Abby," he said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of a solemn oath. "Not because you're running from the past, but because your heart belongs to this grass, same as mine." Abby looked down at their joined hands, one pair large and scarred from war, the other smaller but hardened by the kitchen iron and the flour dough. They looked right together, balanced. "I'm staying, Silas," she said, her green eyes clear as the creek water. "The trail ends here." Outside, the kitchen door groaned open, and Juanita marched in with a fresh bucket of well water, her face still pinched from the night's trouble, but her eyes bright with a stubborn, unbroken life. She looked at the two of them standing by the window, their hands clasped together in the morning light. "The water is cold, and the stove needs wood," Juanita grunted, though a slow, knowing smile spread across her dark wrinkles. "The world keeps turning. Chicanos, we have a ranch to run." Silas let go of Abby's hands, a real genuine smile breaking across his scarred features for the first time in days. "I'll get the wood. Juanita, don't go throwing that spoon at me." The spring didn't come with a shout. It came with a quiet, green whisper that ran through the valley, turning the dead yellow clay into a carpet of sweet clover and pale blue desert willow. A year had passed since the night the gun spoke on the porch. The Woodward Ranch looked different now. The broken windows had been replaced with clean glass shipped from St. Louis. The log walls had been whitewashed, and a small, neat spring house had been built over the creek bed, its stone walls keeping the milk pots and the fresh butter cool against the rising heat. But the biggest change sat 100 yards from the main house, under the shade of a massive, ancient cottonwood tree. It was a small, open-sided timber shack, that Caleb and Taza had raised during the winter thaws. Inside sat 4 long pine benches and a small slate chalkboard pinned to a cedar post. Abby stood by the chalkboard, a piece of white chalk held between her fingers. She wore a new dress of deep indigo wool, the collar finished with a simple strip of white lace Juanita had given her for a wedding gift. Her auburn hair was pulled back with a green ribbon, leaving her face open to the cool morning breeze. Sitting on the benches were 6 children. 2 were Juanita's nephews, brought down from the mountains after their father died in the silver mines. 3 were the children of a black family that had taken up a sharecropping lease on the south pasture. The last was a young Apache girl, Taza's sister, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "All right," Abby said, her voice carrying a steady, rhythmic cadence that matched the rustle of the cottonwood leaves overhead. "Let's look at the line again. A, B, C. Every letter has a sound, and every sound belongs to a word. When you put the words together, nobody can lie to you about what's written on the paper." She knelt down in the red dirt next to the youngest boy, a dark-skinned child named Little Joe, whose father had spent his entire youth in chains back in Georgia. Joe's fingers were small, clumsy, and stained with the purple juice of the wild mulberries he'd gathered by the creek. Abby took his small hand in hers, her fingers guiding his as he drew a shaky, uneven letter A in the soft dirt floor of the schoolhouse. "Keep it steady, Joe," she whispered, her voice gentle but firm. "The letter don't care who your father was, and it don't care what color your skin is. It stays the same for everyone. Once you know it, it's yours. Forever." Joe looked up at her, a wide, toothy grin breaking across his dark face. "I made it, Miss Abby. It says an A." "That's right," she said, patting his shoulder. "That's the first step to freedom, Joe. Literacy is the one thing a tyrant can confiscate once you've got it in your head." From the edge of the clearing, the sound of a lone horse approaching broke the morning quiet. Abby stood up, dusting the red dirt from her skirt. Silas rode up on his big buckskin stallion, his Stetson tilted back to let the sun hit his face. He looked at the children sitting on the benches. Then his gaze shifted to Abby. There was a deep, quiet pride in his eyes, the kind of look a man gives a crop that has finally come up green after a long drought. He dismounted, leaving the reins loose so the stallion could graze on the clover. He walked over to the edge of the schoolhouse roof, resting his broad shoulder against a cedar support post. "You're starting 'em early today, Mrs. Woodward," Silas said, his gravelly drawl carrying a warm, lazy humor. The sun don't wait for the lesson, Mr. Woodward, Abby teased back, her eyes sparkling with a light that had never faded since their wedding at the town church 6 months ago. She turned back to the children. Class dismissed for dinner. Go on down to the kitchen. Juanita's got a basket of cold biscuits and fresh plums waiting on the porch. The children didn't need to be told twice. They exploded off the benches in a cloud of dust and flying heels, their laughter ringing through the timber as they raced toward the main house. Little Joe was in the lead, his bare feet kicking up clods of red earth. Abby watched them go, her heart feeling so large in her chest it felt tight. She walked over to the slate board, using a piece of wool rag to wipe away the chalk dust. Silas walked into the shade, his heavy boots making a quiet crunch in the dirt floor. He stopped behind her, his large arms coming around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, the smell of leather, grass, and sun-warmed wool enveloping her like a blanket. Caleb says the county school board sent a letter down with the mail rider today, Seifel said quietly, his voice vibrating against her back. They say they won't provide any books or slates for a school that takes in coloreds and Indians. Said it's against the territory statute to mix the funds. Abby went still. She turned around in his arms, her eyes flashing with that same fierce Boston abolitionist fire that her father had carried to his grave. They can keep their funds. Silas, we don't need their paper. And we don't need their permission to teach children how to be human beings. I told Caleb the same thing, Silas said, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. The sound of silver coins jingled inside. I sold 20 head of 3-year-olds to the rail agent in Otero yesterday. Got a fair price, too. Half of this silver is going to a freighter coming out of Denver next week. He's bringing 2 boxes of real readers, 3 slates for every bench, and a real dictionary. He placed the pouch in her hand, his fingers closing her calloused hand around the leather. A community ain't built by a statute, Abby, Silas said, his gray eyes clear and deep as the mountain sky. It's built by what we choose to give the children. The law can say whatever it wants on its ledger books. But as long as I've got grass, and as long as I've got beef to sell, every child on this creek is going to have an equal chance to lift their head up. We don't raise servants here. We raise free people. Abby looked down at the heavy pouch of silver in her palm. She looked at the letters written on the slate board behind him. She remembered the crossroads. She remembered the dry, bitter taste of the alkali dust, and the cruel laugh of the peddler who wanted to buy her dignity for a drink of water. It felt like a story she had read in an old book long ago. A different life, a different girl. She reached up, her hand wrapping around Silas's neck, pulling his face down to hers. His lips were warm, that familiar, gravelly texture she loved, tasting of the prairie and the clean mountain wind. You're a good man, Silas Woodward, she whispered against his cheek, her fingers tracing the pale scar on his jaw. I'm just a man who found his direction. Abby, he said softly, holding her close as the noon sun hit the top of the cottonwood tree, turning the leaves into a canopy of dancing green gold. And I'm exactly where I belong. The twilight didn't just fade. It bled into the valleys, a slow wash of deep amber and lavender that turned the rugged ridges of the New Mexico line into a painting of old gold. Down in the ranch yard, the massive cottonwood trees were strung with paper lanterns. They glowed with a warm, flickering light that danced across the swept dirt and the smiling faces of 50 souls. The air was thick with the rich, savory smell of roasted beef, charred chiles, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of Juanita's fresh-baked wedding bread. From the edge of the porch, the rhythmic, lively scraping of a fiddle cut through the evening breeze. Saw scrape, trill, saw scrape. It was an old Tennessee tune, played by a freedman who had traveled 3 days from the railroad just to see the Woodward name honored. Abby stood on the porch, her back resting against a stout cedar pillar. She wore her wedding dress, a simple, elegant gown of cream-colored cotton with a delicate strip of white lace at the collar that she and Juanita had spent 3 weeks stitching by the hearth light. She looked down at the yard. She saw Caleb, his leg heeled straight and strong, dancing a slow, dignified waltz with Juanita. She saw Taza laughing with the children from the South sharecrop, his long black hair swinging in time with the fiddle strings. These were people the territory called outcasts, people the town of Otero would have left to freeze in the mud. But here, under the lantern Silas had hung, they were just people. Free, safe, family. A heavy, familiar step sounded on the floorboards behind her. Creak, thud, creak. Silas stepped out of the shadows of the house. He had on his best black broadcloth coat and a clean white linen shirt that made the dark, sun-bronzed skin of his face look like old walnut wood. The pale scar on his jaw was smooth tonight, free of the hard tension that usually sat there when he looked out at the frontier. He didn't speak right away. He just stepped up beside her, his broad shoulder brushing against hers, his gray eyes watching the dancers in the dirt. "Juanita's on her third cup of that sweet cider," Silas said, his deep gravelly drawl carrying a rare, lazy humor. "If Caleb don't sit her down soon, she's going to start throwing that wooden spoon at the fiddler." Abby let out a soft, rhythmic laugh that felt light in her chest. "Let her dance, Silas. She's earned a night without the stove." "We all have," Silas murmured. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers wrapping around her hand. The gold band on her finger was cold against his palm, but his skin was warm. Secure, he gently pulled her closer, his gaze drifting past the lanterns, past the corrals, toward the dark, empty miles of the South Valley where the trails met. "You remember what that border peddler told you at the crossroads, Abby?" Silas asked, his voice dropping low, matching the steady, slow drone of the fiddle's lower strings. "The day the doozer left you in the red dirt." Abby leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes fixing on the distant silhouette of the purple mountains. "I remember. He said nobody sells you hope for free out here on the line." "He was a fool," Silas said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of a truth he had spent 12 years digging out of the frontier clay. "He thought hope was something you carried in a ledger book, something you could trade for a body or a bag of silver coin. He didn't know that hope ain't a commodity, Abby. You can't buy it, and you can't sell it." He turned her fully to face him, his hands resting steady on her waist. The light from the paper lanterns caught the flecks of dark silver in his gray eyes. "Hope only grows when a person stands up and says the word enough," Silas said, his voice raw with a quiet, powerful reverence. "It grows when a stubborn rancher looks at a broken girl in the dirt and tells her she is a human being with a right to breathe. And it grows when that same girl takes a piece of chalk and teaches a child that his mind belongs to him, no matter what the territory statute says. We didn't buy this life, Abby. We built it, with our own calloused hands." Abby reached up, her fingers tracing the pale, jagged scar on his jawline. She thought about the terrified, desperate girl who had sat on that sun-baked rock with a piece of flint in her fist, waiting for the desert to finish her. That girl was gone. The woman standing on this porch was whole, confident, loved. "You were right, Silas," she whispered against his cheek, her voice steady and certain as the mountain stone. "This isn't a hiding place anymore. This is exactly where I belong. Always," Silas said, his lips finding hers in a long, slow kiss that tasted of the clean night wind and the promise of all the tomorrows still to come. The fiddle music swelled, a bright, triumphant chord that echoed up into the dark canopy of the cottonwood trees. Down in the yard, little Joe was clapping his hands in time with the dance, his small fingers tracing the rhythm of a new language, a new freedom, a new world. The door to the house stood wide open behind them, the yellow light from the hearth spilling across the threshold, welcoming them in. They were home, truly, completely home.
This story is a work of fiction, created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of the trail for Abigail Vance, and the true beginning of the rest of her life. When you look back at the vast, sun-baked expanses of the Trans-Pecos, or the rugged cedar breaks of the New Mexico line, it's easy to believe that the desert itself is the cruelest force under God's sun. We see the white-hot heat that makes the horizon bleed, the choking alkali dust, and the turkey vultures circling overhead like undertakers waiting at a deathbed. But if these stories teach us anything, it's that the harshest, most barren wilderness isn't made of jagged red rock or blistering limestone. It's found in the cold, transactional hearts of folks like Maura Vance and Harlan industrious stepfathers who look at a vulnerable young soul and see nothing but an inconvenience, a debt to be paid, or a piece of livestock to be bartered away for a fistful of silver. The primary file we've traveled through today reminds us of a fundamental truth that transcends any territory or ledger book. A human life is not a commodity. No matter how much gold a railroad syndicate hoards, or how powerful a speculator claims to be, no human being has the right to strip another of their inherent dignity. Maura Vance famously spat the words, "Dead men don't own dirt, Abby, and neither do orphans." But she was dead wrong, as both Jedediah Walker and Silas Woodward proved in their own rugged ways. The laws written by men in high white collars can never override the eternal law of the sky. The law that dictates every soul that breathes has an inherent right to the shade, the water, and the truth. Abigail survived the desert heat because she carried her father's spirit like a hidden flame. Dr. Thomas Vance taught her that tears are just water, and out here, you don't waste life-giving water on the dirt. You use it to breathe, and you use it to take the next step. But she also survived because powerful men chose to stop their horses. In a frontier that often rides right past the suffering of the weak, Jedediah and Silas showed us what true righteousness looks like. It isn't measured by the thousands of cattle you herd or the wealth you accumulate. It's measured by your willingness to hold the gate for the stranger, the orphan, and the outcast. They didn't offer Abby the cheap, short rope of pity or charity that makes the giver feel large and the receiver feel small. They offered her respect, honest wages for honest work, and a safe place to heal her broken bones. Whether it was gentling the chestnut filly, Honey, or taking up a piece of white chalk to teach children how to read so tyrants could never lie to them again, Abigail proved she was never dead weight. When the Vance Walker mark was etched onto the leather, it wasn't a brand of ownership. It was a shield of protection and a sacred covenant. The corrupt speculators and the roaring locomotives ultimately had to turn around because they met an unyielding boundary line made of honor. So, as the evening lanterns flicker under the cottonwood trees and the wind whistles through the cedar logs, let this story stay in your ears like a steady heartbeat. Let the dirt take the memory of the cruel crossroads, for the grass doesn't remember the winter. Once the spring sun hits the valley, never look down on a person wearing rags. Never bow your head to a speculator with a gold chain across his vest. And always be the neighbor who watches the night when another's lantern goes out. Abigail walked out of the Red Rock country and found her way home, proving that when courage meets compassion, the frost inside the human heart finally melts away. Thank you for listening, friends. May your own trail always lead you down into the valleys where the water runs clear, and may you always find people who keep their word. Good night.